and I will read the statement. Let me know when we're live.
We're all set.
Thank you, Bailey. Pursuant to Section 5, Chapter 231 of the Public Laws of New Jersey, this is to state for the record that adequate notice of this meeting has been provided to the public by posting and maintaining the annual notice of regular meetings on the bulletin board at the Municipal building, by mailing the annual notice of regular meetings for 2022 to the News Record and Star Ledger in December 2021, and by filing said notice in the office of the Township Clerk.
Ms. Adams?
Here.
Ms. Croy?
Here.
Mr. DeLuca?
Here.
Mr. McGehee?
Here.
Mayor Daffis?
Here.
Whereas Chapter 231, Public Laws of 1975, known as the Open Public Meetings Act, requires all means of public bodies be open to the public. And whereas Section 7A provides that the governing body has the discretion to permit, prohibit, or regulate the active participation of the public at any meeting, and whereas desire of the governing body to comply with the provisions of this act, same time, and conduct its business in an orderly and expeditious manner, now therefore be resolved by the Township Committee, Township of Maplewood, does hereby prohibit, except as set forth in the formal agenda, active participation in the deliberations of the governing body by the public, except as otherwise described by law, does limit the public to the observations of the actions and discussions of the governing body at all of its regular and special meetings.
So moved.
Moved. Second.
Second.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Ms. Croy?
Yes.
Mr. DeLuca?
Yes.
Mr. McGehee?
Yes.
Mayor Daffis?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fritzen. And I asked my colleagues, just so that we're consistent with all of our public meetings, to join me in the salute to the American flag before we move forward. Pledge allegiance to the flag
Flag
of the
United States of America and to the republic which is one nation under God, indivisible.
Liberty and justice for all.
Good evening, friends and neighbors, to our last budget workshop. And we apologize for our delay in coming into open session. We had a very thorough discussion in closed about personnel. This brings us to open. And I'm going to cue our CFO, Mr. Koloje, and after him, our Township Administrator, Mr. Jerry Jimes, to walk us through what our budget looks like. Mr. Koloje?
Thank you, Mayor. Let's see if I can get to the beginning. Uh-oh. Little technical difficulties, my apologies. Let's do this. Screen share. This is the screen. And let's bring up a PowerPoint presentation. All right, thank you, Mayor. So we'll start out with this screen, which I think everyone on the TC has seen. This was a document that Mr. Jimes had shared to you earlier or later last week. Mr. Jimes had supplied me with a chart modeled after Randolph on the left here, which broke down expenses. It roughly lines up with the user-friendly budget. There's a few quirky lines to it that are a little off, but from that data, which these are our budget numbers, we were able to produce a couple pie charts for you. We move to the next pie chart. This shows us our revenues, which is the top part of the chart on the left. Clearly, welcome to New Jersey. The largest portion of our budget is based on property taxes. There are also areas for grants, the receipt of delinquent taxes. This is our shared services over here. State aid, miscellaneous revenue. Miscellaneous revenue, because of the pandemic, has been shrinking. This part of the pie chart has been shrinking for the last 2 years. Hopefully, this is the year that it starts to rebound. I want to call everyone's attention to the state aid one, though, and this next slide is going to show why. The mayor had provided us with a worksheet that enabled us to take a look at what our state aid is and what our state aid is supposed to be. And this chart basically shows us the blue is statutorily what the state is supposed to provide to us. The green is what the state has actually been providing to us. And you can see since 2010, the new increase has been called flat. And the yellow tracks the actual gap between what we're supposed to be getting and what we are actually getting. And I'll call attention to this particular item here. And it is only a projection at this point in time because they haven't settled on their COLA increase for the statutory rate. But we are looking at getting shortchanged by the state $2.1 million this year. To put that into perspective, that's roughly 5.5 tax points. And if the state was actually funding us what we were supposed to be getting, we would be looking at a 0% tax increase this year. The next line is in the chart towards the bottom is expenditures. This just breaks it down again, somewhat user-friendly budget, but it clearly shows that the biggest portion of our spending comes in public safety. So that's police and fire. DPW comes next. You've got general government, which covers things like the finance department, administration, over in community programs. We're looking at community services and community development. It should be noted here that statutory expenditures are something that we have very little control over, and that represents 11.4% of our budget. And we can also take a look at our debt service, which at this point in time is 13.8% of our budget. But it should also be noted that debt service is typically like trying to steer a cruise ship. There's no sharp turns. Anything we do this year will show some impact, but minimal next year, and we really wouldn't see any kind of movement in debt service until 2024. So when we last met for our work session, we were talking about how we had a $400,000 gap in our budget. And that was because all of our calculations at the time were based on the 2% hard cap. As you are aware, we have no cap bank. And so we are at the mercy of whatever the 2% hard stop is. However, the state does put into place certain expenses that they consider outside the cap, and that's oftentimes why the public will say, I thought there's a 2% cap. How can you possibly be going up 3%? It's these exceptions that are what drive it. And the three biggest exceptions in this year's budget is that our debt service is increased by $331,000. We had a pandemic note that we sold for $2 million to ourselves last year in order to have 0% interest. But this is the year that we need to start paying it back. So that's $400,000 that came into our budget. And pension obligations continue to rise this year to the tune of almost $155,000. So all said and done, these three items alone are worth roughly 2.3 tax points. And when you add that to the 2 tax points that we're looking at, that gets us close to the increase that we've been talking about over the past couple weeks. So Mr. Jimes and Ms. Barnett and myself met last week to discuss where we look. And this is a little bit of a tax rate analysis trend. The top chart shows us what our historical data is for the past 5 years. Mr. Jimes had asked for me to identify some areas that we can comfortably trim without really hurting ourselves in the future. And that would represent these first few lines. The landscape and the electrical maintenance wages for the library are something that we can cut without hurting the library. We can shave some of our storm cleanup, both road salt, sand, and overtime, without depleting our trust fund, which when I came on board in 2018 was down into the 5 figures. And then while we were having that discussion, Mr. Jimes had identified 4 positions that he was going to look to eliminate that were new requests, and he was going to look to adjust the requests from the various departments regarding personnel. And if we do these things combined, that gets us almost to a tax point. A tax point is actually $388,500. And so this chart here kind of shows what we're proposing from a budget perspective, and a 5.3% increase. And then the line just underneath it is if we actually cut the penny out of the rate, this is what it would sort of look like. I would caution against that, however, because this next slide is going to show us the difficulties we're facing in terms of fund balance, which some people prefer to call surplus. In 2018, we had at the beginning of the year coming into the budget $4.1 million in fund balance, and we used $3.3 $3 million of that in order to generate revenue for the budget. Unfortunately, in that year, we were only able to replenish about $1 million worth of that. So roughly $2.3 million worth of our fund balance was lost come the end of the 2018 budget. For the next 3 years, you can see that we stayed at somewhere around 1.3, 1.2, $1.3 million, which has somewhat leveled our fund balance. In 2019, we actually saw somewhat of an increase. That's somewhat of a false increase because this number was generated predominantly by the ARP money that we received. $1.3 million had come in, and that helped, that was actually our note that we sold to ourselves, $2 million that we're now paying off at $400,000 for the next 5 years. And so that's what pushed this fund balance back up. Again, these 2 pandemic years have certainly taken its toll on us, as we have not generated revenue in things like court, parking. Recreation's actually been doing well, and so is building. But these are some of the areas, the Woodlands, another area where we've struggled with our shrinking part of the pie chart for alternate revenues. We're projecting this year that we're going to wind up with somewhere around $1.7 million in fund balance. All these numbers are yet to be verified until we can finish the annual financial statement. But that being said, part of the reason why I would recommend against trying for a penny cut is that precariously, you can see with $1.7 million in fund balance and anticipating $1.5 million as a revenue source, that's going to leave us with $200,000 in fund balance for what is essentially a $51 million budget. And that is dangerously low, to say the least, and will, in all likelihood, create cash flow issues for us as we move forward. The other thing that we have hanging over our head, and I don't have a slide for it, so we can get out of this. Let me figure out how to stop sharing. There we go. Is that we also have a deferred charge from IRA. We passed a special emergency resolution in September for $1 million. We anticipated that we were going to receive insurance money by the end of the year in order to accommodate or to pay that amount off, to which we would then have to raise the balance of whatever the insurance company didn't pay us as a deferred charge in the following year, or we can cancel it if we got paid in full by the insurance company. Unfortunately, the insurance company has only given us about $196,000 in what is essentially a $1 million bill. So we have roughly an $800,000 liability as a deferred charge. I'm talking with the auditors now about the ability to stretch that out over 3 years instead of having to raise it for the full year. And so that 1 cent difference between 93 cents on the rate and 92 cents on the rate may wind up needing to be used in order to fund this deferred charge for IRA until we can get the insurance money in. And obviously, once we did, that would fix a lot of woes in terms of our fund balance in 2023's budget. And that pretty much covers what I thought you wanted me to discuss, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Kaloja. Mr. Jimes, would you further summarize? I know you prepared some things for us to look at as well, and you had shared those with the Township Committee members in advance.
Yeah, I mean, not much to add. I mean, most of what I had were probably more complicated versions of what Joe was showing or CFO was showing. So it touched on, pretty much everything I had. I can
Can you pull up the one where you compare where we are now with the additional tax point that's not recommended? If you go there.
Okay.
That spreadsheet. There you go.
Yep. So this is what we had, submitted at the 5.4. And if you were to reduce it a tax point based on these red recommendations, you would get it down to about 4.27. It's not a full, 388. It's full because when you change that, it adjusts the reserve for uncollected taxes. So it would actually go down to about 4.27 as opposed to 5.4. But as a CFO referenced, all the risk that would, be associated with that for what amounts to, we never want to say anything small to the residents, but what amounts to a relatively small, change, based on the risk.
Right. So, I think the summary here is, and correct me if I'm wrong, either Jerry, Mr. Jimes rather, or Mr. Koloje, but for all of the items that were enumerated in the pie charts that are outside of the levy cap, the pension, the deferred charges, the debt service going up, which is a good thing because next year and the following year we'll be in a better financial situation having paid off more debt. We would be looking closer at a 2.9 to 3%.
That's correct. That's an accurate assessment.
Right. And this proposal here still allows us to maintain our fund balance and not further decrease that and put us at more risk in that regard.
Yes, and I forgive me if the CFO mentioned this, but it would also allow us to build up a little more of a cap bank than we had in the past. I think that was 157,000. Is that still correct? Okay, so $157,000 in the cap bank, which I don't think, hopefully we won't need in the future because of what the mayor just mentioned is our better position in the years forward, but it's always good to have that cap bank.
Right. So the 5.4, can you talk a little bit about what that represents per averaged assessed home?
Sure, that would amount to $236.36 based on the average assessment of $1,500.
So that's what, about $19, let's say $20 a month.
Yes. And if we did that risky kind of lowering it for a point, that $19 goes down to $15.52. So you have to balance, is that $4 a month really worth it for taking on that risk? And, I think we, internally when we were discussing, we didn't think it was, as the CFO said, and I agree with that assessment.
Right.
Could you explain the risk again that you're referring to?
CFO, Mr. Koloje, can you talk about how that would affect the fund balance and the cash flow when you talk about things like payroll and school taxes and payments?
So until we finish the annual financial statement, the numbers aren't necessarily solid, but we're projecting that we're going to have $1.7 million in fund balance or surplus. And so what we would do if we're adopting this budget and we're going to utilize $1.5 million worth of that right off the bat as a revenue source, that's going to leave us essentially $200,000 sitting in our checking accounts. And our obligations are $6.5 million to the school district every month. And every quarter we're sending, close to $1.5 million to $2 million over to the county between their open space and their budget. And in addition to that, we're talking about meeting payroll every 2 weeks. And so oftentimes what people see as surplus is actually the funds that are sitting in the bank, giving us the ability to be able to pay our bills until the next tax collection cycle comes along. It's not much different than a school teacher trying to budget their money because they get 10 months worth of paychecks and then they need to figure out how to spend the next 2 months paying their mortgage and putting food on the table before they go back to work in September and start earning a paycheck again. So it's a very similar function for us in terms of what fund balance is. And when that winds up becoming too low, we run into the difficulty of being able to meet our obligations, such as payroll and school taxes in the same year, in addition to whatever we're purchasing for other expenses in order to actually operate our various departments and provide our services. The other issue with fund balance dropping down that low is that rating agencies typically look to see fund balance sit somewhere between 4 and 8% of your operating budget. So just to make my math simple, if we're looking at a $50 million budget, they want to see $2 million to $4 million sitting in fund balance to know that we can weather any storm that comes our way. And when they see that our fund balance is not going to be within that range, that typically affects our credit rating. And while right now we wisely bonded last year to lock in on low rates, we can all see where rates are going at this point in time. We do have an $8.9 million note that needs to get renewed in July. And we have additional capital projects that we're going to also need to sell a note on so that we can move forward with those projects as well. Where our fund balance lands is going to affect the interest rate we're going to receive. And so while it won't hurt us in this particular year, because this is the year we're borrowing the money, in 2023, when we go to pay back the $8.9 million we borrowed, plus whatever we borrowed for this year's capital projects, we may be doing so at an interest rate of somewhere around 3 or 4%. And to put that into perspective, right now, the interest rate that we have for our $8.9 million bond, because our fund balance was solid last year, is somewhere around 0.15%. So that's the difficulty with becoming over reliant upon a fund balance in order to balance a budget.
So correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't the year before 1.6 in the fund balance? We were, from the presentation you made, I thought we were only at 2 million.
We were at 2.3 million by the end of the year, but that was predominantly because we sold the pandemic note that we borrowed in order to cover lost revenues. We sold a $2 million note to ourselves. We charged ourselves 0% interest. We utilized our general capital fund as the funding source to borrow the money from. Obviously, we need to now pay back the general capital fund in order to pay the various contractors for the projects they're doing. And this is the year that statutorily we're required to start paying that back over the course of 5 years. So this year, we're going to pay $400,000 towards that note. And when we renew it in December, it will get renewed for $1.6 million. But that driver, that note that we sold to ourselves is what inflated our fund balance. Otherwise, we would have ended this year at somewhere around $300,000 or I'm sorry, $300,000 worth of fund balance. And we're basically going to end up there with this budget that we adopt. We're going to start the year with $200,000 available.
I just want you and Mr. Jimes to be careful in labeling, the difference in the monthly average impact kind of statement to, well, it's only $4 more. It's only, $50 more for the year, whatever. This is only like 26% of the budget. I mean, of the taxes for the property taxes. So I just think, given where we live and how obnoxious our property taxes are and how little control we as a municipality have over them, that literally, like, it may seem like not a lot, but then you still have like 75% more of increases from the schools in the county that we need to be cognizant of. So it may seem like, oh, it's only $4 a month for everybody. I just don't want to fall into that to justify increasing it. I need the justification to be that, some of what Mr. Kaloje just said. So that's just, I'm just putting that out there as something we need to be careful of in assuming that it's not a lot of money.
Right. And I don't think anyone was suggesting that, Ms. Adams, but.
That's what I heard, Mayor.
Yeah, I'm sorry that you heard that. But that's not what we were suggesting. It's certainly not what I was suggesting, but people want to know what it means to them per month. And that's what we were doing. And we do that every budget. I've sat in 6 of these and we do it every year.
Absolutely. I'm not saying we shouldn't say what it is. I'm just saying we shouldn't act as if it's not a lot just because it may not seem like a lot. You know what I mean?
A lot. No one is acting like it's not a lot. This is very, very difficult for all of us. There's no question about that. Mr. McGehee.
Thank you, Mayor. Looking at the numbers over the last couple of days and understanding the risk and the rewards, I align with Mr. Jimes and our CFO. I think that's most prudent. It sets us up for, I like to say a rainy day, but to be conservative. If you look at the last 2 years, our run rate of having issues have been significant. IDA in September, COVID in 2020. So I think it's most prudent to align with our CFO, as well as our township administrator, and not look to trim the budget, but to stay in line with the recommendations that have been provided. Thank you, Mayor.
Deputy Mayor DeLuca.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor. This is all horrible, no matter how you cut it. With the average assessed home at $500,000, a 3% tax increase is $1,500. And it's likely that's where we'll end up, probably about 3.5 when you figure this, the county and the school and us. I too am concerned about cutting it a little too close. I think that I would go with the first column, what is it, the 9.30 to 2020 tax rate. I just think that we have a lot of shocks in the last few years, and we do need to rebuild. I'm a little concerned about the budget factors for 2023. I'm not sure. Well, first off, I don't think we're going to get any FEMA reimbursement on the pandemic. I don't know where that's coming from, the 133. And the 750 on potential FEMA reimbursement in the future, I think that's optimistic, to be honest. I've been meeting with these folks every 2 weeks, and there's a lot of hurdles here, and our insurance is really going to have to step up here. So I'm not sure. I don't want to say that next year is going to be a breeze, and so I am concerned about next year, and I think building sufficient resources to get us through this year so that we don't have to draw on anything for next year on an emergency basis is a wise move. So I would go with the 0.93 tax rate.
Thank you. Committee Member Cripe?
I hate raising things, but at the same time, it's not free. Everything costs more. And I fear, just with the storm that's currently brewing off the coast in New York, the idea of cutting down our salt and our sand and our maintenance of the roads and things like that is the wrong direction. And as much as I hate the increase, I do like a rainy day fund. And more, I think we're going to have to start thinking we have to carry this ourselves and not count on the government, not count on the state to give us, frankly, what they owe us on time or any assistance, because we, the collective, not we, every single person, are probably doing a little bit better financially than many communities are. So I just wonder if there is a split. Is there like option 3 available? And I hate to throw this out at the last minute, but for those people like me who don't live in a $500,000 house, and if I was on a single income, a $1,500 increase is a pretty large jump for me. If I was a single person, I'm thinking of our seniors. I'm thinking of our single parents, our single income homes. How big is this jump really going to affect them? So I wonder if there's an option 3 that kind of sits in the middle for those folks.
So we did, talk about when we had a meeting last week, half of that 388, which is, 190 something and change. And, it's, not to cop out, but it's tough. I mean, you're at a point where, for the reasons, to see it. And I understand the point and I take it very seriously. I really do, committee point. But as the CFO mentioned, some of those risks are, really challenging. And when you get to a point, and not just Maplewood, but in a lot of municipal budgets, where when you're down to this level of nitty gritty, it's the big items. And those big items that we reduced the last time were the increase a little bit in fund balance, which is a reduction, and the health insurance, which we found some savings in there as well. And then when you start getting into this level of nitty gritty, you're really just talking about person power. You're talking about human capital and what staff members can you do without, right? Like that's just the reality of it when you get to this level. And, we're a relatively lean municipality. But if you ask me to find, a couple employees that would make that up, I would have a very hard time doing that. So I don't even know, maybe the CFO can be creative. I don't know, but we did talk about it unless anything new popped into his head. I can't think of 190 something thousand to even cut that in half. Hate to Again, not
Mr.
diminishing. the
Mr.
increase.
Giles, isn't it true that these get rounded up? So even if you come in at a 925, it gets rounded up to 93.
That's correct, yeah.
And the other thing is we made some decisions earlier when we were talking about personnel that are going to cut into some of these red numbers down here. So I don't think this number here is a real number yet.
Yeah, that's true. I was
So
gonna say,
that's part of the difference splitting. Even if you say, okay, let's cut it, the way the tax stuff works is it gets rounded up. So you want to come in with a whole number.
Yeah.
You don't want to go to that third one.
yeah, and the other thing is, I just want to clarify that when we talk about $1,500, that's the average. It's not $1,500 for everyone. When we talk about a $500,000, excuse me, house, that's the average assessment. So, I mean, that doesn't make it any less painful, clearly. I mean, this is really, really painful and a lot more painful than we had anticipated, even going into this with not much hope. You know, but this does allow us, I think the proposal does allow us the opportunity to, all things considered, maintain the health and wellness of the township and be ready for emergencies. And I think that's the bottom line. Is there a consensus on the proposal? Knowing that this is going to be modified a little bit more in light of our decisions enclosed on personnel.
Mayor, I would recommend and I would move the recommended proposal by the administrator and the CFO.
And just to be clear, those are that's in letter B?
That's in letter. Yep.
Okay, I will second that. With the understanding that whatever we did today still has to get brought down to 9.3.
Right.
Agreed.
Okay, I would second that.
Okay. We need a vote. Township Clerk.
Ms. Adams,
Yes.
Ms. Craig,
Yes,
Mr. DeLuca,
Yes,
Mr. McGehee,
Yes.
Mayor Daffis.
Yes, reluctantly, yes. Thank you, Ms. Fritzen. I think I just froze there for a minute. Can you all hear me okay?
yes.
Yep.
Is there any further discussion?
I would just mention 2 points on the capital budget. You know, nothing significant has changed since we met the last time. Obviously, as you know, with any capital item, as we get to it and get closer, once we pass the ordinance, as we get closer to approval, you know, you still have the opportunity to not fund something if you choose not to in the future. But the capital budget remains largely unchanged, with the exception of there was an addition based on the environmental public works meeting.
Sorry, Mr. Jimes, could you put it up? Because I'm sure the public does not know what you're talking about.
Plus, it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
So the one change was made, we added $50,000 here based on the discussion that we had in the Environmental Public Works Committee meeting last week. I talked to the director and Director Kittner and CFO Koloje, and the director recommended that based on the discussions that we had in that meeting. And there was a kind of a moving around of some funds based on some things we talked about earlier in the road program. But otherwise, everything is largely the same as what it was when we met the last time. So
we
just summary.
I'm sorry, we added 50 to that line. Can you go back
Yes.
to the one you were just
Sure.
referring to? So does that mean that reduced from 500K is that's still valid?
Yes,
Originally 500K, now, then it was 100, now it's 150,
correct. Yes.
to be clear. Okay. And that's all those utility repairs we were talking about for a long time at Engineering Public Works. Right?
And the final, kind of the way that looks now is subtotal of just over $8.2 million. with about 7.677 to be bonded. That includes the, a 5% down payment we have to front and the reallocation of $560,000 from 2 past ordinances. And then some grants as well, net amounts. So we fund them, but we expect to get grants for the DOT and the ADA. So this would be your final bond ordinance number, subject to bond council preparing the ordinance based on this. And what we would need is just a consensus to authorize bond council or authorize the CFO to authorize bond council to move forward with an ordinance based on these.
I would move that because I think we ought to pass this bond ordinance as soon as possible because we have projects that are waiting and we always start late with the road project.
I
And
would
we end up problems with the weather. So the sooner we can get this going, the better.
Yeah, I
Second.
would read my mind. I totally second that. We've got to get these money so we can get those things going.
And
Agreed.
vehicles are years to wait now.
Yeah, the supply chain issues are creating further delays. So I'm going to agree with that. And before we have the roll call officially, I just want to tell the public that, this capital budget really represents our values with this budget. It shows significant investment in infrastructure improvements, which is what we're hearing from residents as we are experiencing climate change right here in real time, right in our little town. Road repair, stormwater management, and flood mitigation. It also represents significant improvements in traffic calming measures. We do that every year, but especially this year as well, because that's what we're hearing from residents. They want to live on streets with families that are safe. They want to drive on roads that are paved, and they want to live in homes that are not flooding. So I'm really proud of this budget, this capital budget. And I'm really proud of our collective efforts in bringing it down and trimming it painfully from the original proposal of 11+ million down to, what is it, 7, I can't see the bottom of this right here right now, but yeah, 7, a little over, 7.5 almost, right? Yeah, so I just wanted to add those remarks. I think it's really important for the public to understand what this represents. So I agree. Can we have a roll call?
Ms. Adams,
Yes.
Ms. Croy,
Yes.
Mr. DeLuca,
Yes,
Mr. McGehee,
Yes.
Mayor Daffis.
Yes.
And we get to vote on this again, right? So it can be tweaked if we want to, because there's a couple things in there I wouldn't mind tweaking.
Well,
No,
we're going to create an ordinance based
right, okay. Well, yeah, but I have to vote on it and we have to talk about it. I'm just saying, there were a couple things, we kind of rushed through it. So I just thought there was a way, as the mother of a gay man and an ally of the LGBTQ plus community. I think the 40,000 for the rainbow crosswalk could be pushed, and there's a couple other things that could be, I think, pushed, or at least if we found the same amount of money, go into the sewer, not the sewer, the stormwater management stuff that we were talking about, and the TVing of the lines and the stormwater issues that we have and the expense that's incurred by those. That's all I was going to say, to move some of that around. I don't want to hear that it's really only 2 points here and there, but we're trimming this and that out of everything, and until we don't. So
Thank you, Mayor DeLuca. I think you.
yeah, I'm sorry, but it doesn't work that way because once we're going to be paying a bond council to prepare an ordinance based on these amounts we approve tonight.
right, I understand that, but I felt like it got called to a vote like before I had a chance to say any of that. So
Oh, well, but
That's why-
if you wanted to reconsider, then you ought to make a motion to reconsider it, because once it comes to us in an ordinance form, we can't make changes. And
Okay,
And then, there's, those things are going to be plugged in there based on that. I mean, if you want to make a motion to reconsider, I will second it just for the purposes of having the conversation. I'll still end up voting for it, but I'm willing to have the conversation.
I just think to the mayor's point, if we're gonna be cutting stuff to focus the money, I don't even mind the total. I might want some of that money to be repositioned elsewhere. So if we don't have like support to do that, then that's fine. But I think some of the priorities, those are the priorities that I would prefer go toward making sure we don't flood out, houses and stuff.
Okay. Any further discussion? Okay. Anything else anyone else want to say? Okay. Next topic is public comment. Do we have any members of the public?
I see no hands, Mayor.
Okay. And with that, we're going to adjourn our budget
I
workshop.
move we adjourn.
Second.
Good night, everyone. See you